All right. Well, it's great to be together again. If this is your first time with us, my name is Lou. I'm one of the pastors here. If you're watching online, we're glad that you're doing that. At this point in the service, what we typically do is continue our teaching series or start a new series, or like today, we are finishing up a teaching series. And so if this is your first week with us, I'll bring you up to speed real quick. It's been a real short series called Real Mature. So here's where we started last week. Last week, I asked you to think of a process of transformation. So for me, right now, I like to think I'm going through a process of transformation. In like March or April, I started playing golf, all right? And it's a hard game. I mean, if you play golf, you know it is a mixture of extreme joy and just like self-loathing all at the same time. It's a very difficult thing. And so I started playing in March. I went golfing with my buddy. He's really good. I am not. And he swings, and his swing is just, it's so smooth. You know, he just lets the club do the work. It's so natural. The ball goes a gazillion miles away. I get up there, and I just give it all I've got. Like, I'm swinging as hard as I can. He looks at me. He's like, man, you are swinging out of your shoes. You got to chill out. And so I'm trying to learn because that's counterintuitive. You know, you wouldn't think. Like, if you swing slow, the club will just send the ball. If you swing hard, it doesn't go anywhere. Still trying to figure out how to make my ball travel. But I like to think that I'm making progress in this process of transformation. Right? The example I gave you last week was lifting weights. If you're someone who just starts out lifting weights, that's a process. And you'll make progress if you stick with it. You'll notice you get a little bit stronger. You might notice your body starts taking shape, right? But what I also asked you last week was to think of the final product of that process, specifically lifting weights, right? If you take your commitment level to that process and you dial it up to 100, like you're all in to the process of lifting weights, what do you picture when you picture the final product of this process? Like, who will you become if you give yourself completely to that process? And what we said last week is if you picture, someone who's all in the process of lifting weights, you become like a bodybuilder, right? You think of Arnold Schwarzenegger or someone who's like pulling a train with their teeth. You know those people, right? Like, actually, I spoke to someone this past week. We've got two people in our church who have been like professional bodybuilders, and that's their thing. That's the picture of where you go if you go all the way with that process. Now, how you feel about the final product of that process will determine whether or not you're a participant in that process. And if you do choose to be part of that process, how far you go, right? If you want to become that, you'll go all in. If you don't, you'll probably hold back. And the parallel here is with following Jesus, that's a process of transformation. Right? There is change that's happening if you embrace the growth of your faith. But the question I asked you was, what do you picture when you picture the final product of that process? Like, if you take your level of commitment to following Jesus and you crank it up to 100, like max it out, what do you picture when you picture who you will become? The question we've been asking is, what does all in really look like? Or what does spiritual maturity really look like? What does it actually look like if I were to crank my level of commitment, devotion, whatever you want to call it, if I crank that up to 100%, what do I become? And the reason we're asking and trying to answer that question is because your picture, your concept of who you'll become and how you feel about that picture will determine whether or not you want to be part of this process. And if you're already in this process, how far you want to go. Like, maybe you're someone who's not typically in church. Someone just promised you breakfast or twisted your arm to get here. And you're like, oh yeah, the reason I'm not doing this is because I know where that road leads and I don't want to become that. And so we're looking at what that actually is. Because maybe it's a lot better than what you think. Or maybe you're holding back because you don't want to become that. Last week, we answered the question, like, what does real maturity look like in the mirror? Like, how am I changing? personally? How do I understand what's going on within me, with who I'm becoming? And what's amazing is that this issue has been an issue really since the beginning of the church. We looked at an ancient letter written by an ancient teacher who basically says that where this goes, what this turns into, the person you become, it's not someone who's outwardly religious, it's someone who's inwardly transformed. It's not someone who's obsessed with the rules, it's someone who's getting to know Jesus in a way that transforms them. They become a person who is more like Jesus. What we said is the final product in the mirror is someone who is becoming like Jesus through being with him, like being aware of his presence, doing things that remind you of who he is, like things like going to church or praying or joining a group, like things like that. And Jesus, the picture of Jesus, is not someone who's outwardly religious. In fact, he was so normal, it threw people off. But he was someone who was love and joy and peace and patient and kind. And that is a picture that's attractive. Like that's where this road leads. If you're wondering, who am I becoming if I give into this completely? It's someone who's becoming more and more loving, more and more joyful, more and more peaceful. That's what you should see in the mirror. But this week, we're looking at it from a different angle. The question we're asking is, if I crank up my level of commitment, if I turn it up to 100, if I go all in on this process, how's that going over with the other people in my life? Like if last week was, what does real maturity look like in the mirror? This week, the question is, what does real maturity look like to those around me? Specifically, to those who are inside my life, but outside my faith, right? So maybe there's people in your friend group, you start going to church, your faith begins to develop and grow, right? Well, how is that being perceived and understood by your friends? And how are you supposed to act toward them? What's changing there? Or at home, right? Maybe the person you're married to is inside your life, but outside your faith. Well, how are they perceiving what's going on within you, this process of transformation? How do you act toward them? Or maybe it's people you work with, and you've embraced this faith thing, and something's changing, and this is becoming real. You've never gotten on board with this. Well, something's happening. How does that change what's going on at work, especially with those who are inside your life, but outside of your faith? How should we be perceived by those who don't believe what we believe? And how do we act toward them? Okay, so take that question, right, and just set it aside for a minute. That's where we're going. But here's where we need to start to kind of build the logic behind here, right? So if you know the story of Jesus, you know that he had some followers. We call them disciples. There are these 12 guys that followed him around everywhere. And they were in this school of learning how to become Jesus followers. They basically lived with him for 3 years. They were with him and they were becoming like him. And at the end of his time with them, he's getting ready to leave. They've become as mature as he's going to get them, and they are all in on this process. They're all in on this process. And here's what he says to them. Here's what maturity looks like to them, or should look like to them. He says, "Go, therefore, and make disciples," he's saying this to his disciples, "of all nations," everywhere, not just in your hometown, just in your area, but all over the place. And here's how you do it. He says, baptizing them, identifying them with the one you've come to trust in, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I've commanded you, passing on my teachings to them. He says to his disciples, go and make disciples. Now, in the ancient Greek language, there's typically a main verb, and then there's all these supporting verbs. The main verb here is one word that means make disciples. The word go is while you're going, make disciples. And baptizing and teaching, it's make disciples by baptizing them and teaching them. But the idea here, to his disciples. He's like, you're all in, you're on board with this, you're growing, you're reaching a place of maturity. As a disciple, you make disciples. And he says, and here's the reminder, he says, and I'm with you always to the very end of the age. Remember, right? It's about being with Jesus. That's how we become like Jesus. The idea here, to his disciples, he says, make disciples. The idea here, the mark of maturity, what this looks like, if you're going all in, what this looks like to those around you, to the outsiders, it's reproduction. It's insiders inviting outsiders in. Real maturity, it leads to reproduction. The idea is once you get it, you give it. Once you have it, you share it. You receive it, you pass it on. So has anyone have little kids in the school district around here and you've been flocked? Anyone been flocked? All right, well, it's a real magical experience, okay? So one day we're out somewhere, I don't know, we come home and there are flamingos, all plastic, not real, flamingos all over the front lawn. And it's like, congratulations, you've been flocked. And it's like, okay, now we like make a contribution to, I don't know, the PTA or something like that. And it's like, okay, and now you gotta go flock somebody else. And I'm like, really? I gotta go blow up someone else's front lawn with these flamingos? And your kids pick their friend and they go and they, whatever. But and I remember I'm like, we have to? We have to do this? I don't like people on my front lawn. Now I gotta go. But the idea is like, you can't take the flamingos in the house. They're not yours now, right? You get it. It's a process. You got to pass it on. And that's really how the church has continued to grow. People, they get this and they invite others in. They pass it on. They don't bring the flamingos in the house. The idea of real maturity is it's reproduction. Now, this I think can be helpful, especially if you're someone who's in the process of growth or if you've been a follower of Jesus for a while. It's very easy for faith to become all about me and what's happening like within me. And so I want to join as many like Bible studies as I can. And I want to like learn all the Christian things and do all the Christian stuff and have the t-shirts and the sweatshirts and say all the prayer. And it's all about me, me, me. Like when you notice that you're losing the desire to share what you have, that should be an important check engine light, right? I'm not saying all that other stuff is bad stuff. It's good to grow. It's good to embrace knowledge and try to develop a better understanding of what you believe. But if it's no longer something that you're sharing, it's a good indicator that you might be taking a few steps backwards. And so real maturity, it looks like reproduction. It looks like spreading this, sharing this. Now, if you're like me, okay, and like I would hear people talk about this, especially when I first began embracing my faith, and I'd hear the teachings of Jesus. I'd be like, yeah, I can do that and this and that. And then it's like, okay, now go share your faith with other people. And I'd be like, no, like, I'm not doing that. Right? I don't want to be that guy. I don't want to have these awkward conversations about religion with people that aren't looking for it. I don't want to be the one that's like pushing my faith. Like the picture of that is like, I'll do my thing, you do your thing. And so it just like, just decide I'm not going to be part of that. And if you've been there, if that's where you are right now, I get that. I've been there. But the reason you feel that way could be because of the picture that you picture when you picture what it looks like to share what you have. And this was helpful in my process of growth, like coming to understand this. Sometimes when we're looking at the Bible, right, or verses in the Bible, we zoom in. And we're like, this word means this word means this. We get like real close. But sometimes understanding what's happening requires us to zoom out and look at trends over time. And this is one of those things. If you're wondering, okay, like reproduction, passing it along, sharing this. If you're wondering how, it's extremely helpful to look at the trend over time throughout the life of Jesus and even in the life of the church when it first started. What you'll see when Jesus traveled and taught and invited people to come follow him, what you'll see is that people who were nothing like him liked him until they got to the point where they wanted to become like him. In other words, he was extremely attractive. He He was so attractive that he couldn't tell people where he was going. He had to tell people not to share what they just saw because it was wildly inconvenient how well-known he was. Like he literally, logistically, it was an obstacle to travel from place to place because people all wanted what he had to offer. And you might say, okay, well, that's Jesus, right? And that was like he was doing some pretty cool things, right? But we see the same trend in the church at its healthiest. Luke was somebody who wrote, he's a doctor, and so he wrote like real detailed notes. He probably had bad handwriting, but he recorded what happened in the early church. He says, every day, this is like a summary of what's happening in the church. Every day, they continued to meet together in the temple courts, which was like a logistical thing. It was an easy way for them to all gather together. They met in temple courts, but they also met in homes. They broke bread in their homes, and they ate together with glad and sincere hearts. This is life in the early church when it first started. They're praising God, like they're acknowledging the goodness of God. And you ready? Like, can't miss this. Luke writes, enjoying the favor of all the people. Favor. The word in the original language for favor, it has this idea of like the way someone would feel about a precious jewel. Like you want it. You're attracted to it. There's something irresistible, appealing. It's magnetic. And this is the picture of the early church. Like inside, all. I used to have a professor in school, he would say, all means all, and that's all means. Like all the people, insiders, outsiders, this community was attractive. And because of that, Luke writes, the very next sentence he says, and the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. Those who were getting on board, those who were finding hope in this. Like it grew at an uncontrollable rate because it was attractive. The story of the early church was addition by attraction. In other words, people who were nothing like church people liked the church people until eventually they wanted to become like the church people. And it makes perfect sense if you think about it, right? Like if you are becoming more loving, if you are becoming more peaceful, if you're becoming more patient, like more kind, like there's just an anchor of joy in your life that's not dependent on the circumstances of life. There's something about that is attractive. Like people want that. And this was the story. This is how the church grew. People saw that there was a community of insiders that gave outsiders a vision of life that was breathtaking. And so it was addition by attraction. In other words, like real maturity, it leads to reproduction. But the way that happened, the way that this spread was through attraction. It was attraction that led to reproduction. In other words, real maturity, if we're going to connect the dots here, real maturity is attractive. There should be something appealing about what's going on within you. And again, we're talking about if you like crank the level of commitment, like your level of devotion, like you're going all in on this, the picture of where this leads, the final product of full commitment to this process is a picture of someone who is attractive, who's living what Jesus called life to the full. Not perfect life, not easy life, not like you do everything right all the time and you get everything perfectly on the nose. But there is a goodness about your life that is drawing people in. This is the way that it all spread. And so that's, again, if you're zooming out and you're looking at the trends, this is the trend. Like people wanted to dive into this. They wanted to be part of it. They weren't spreading it because they felt like they had to. They were living their lives and people wanted in. But this was also what was being taught behind closed doors. Like if you look at, we have stories of what was happening in the church when it first started, but we also have letters that church leaders wrote to the church people about what life should look like. Peter is a real close friend of Jesus. He wrote a letter, and here's what he says. Here's the explanation behind that example of a life that's irresistible. He says, live such good lives among the pagans. Now, pagan, for us, like that's a real derogatory term. The way this word is being used is not in a negative sense. For them, this was just somebody who's like an outsider when it comes to the stuff that you believe. And so he's saying, live good lives. Now this word for good, there's a word in the original language for good meaning right, like good, not bad. But then there's another word for good that's like, that captures the idea of beauty. And this is the word that Peter uses. He's saying, live lives of goodness, lives of beauty among those on the outside, so that even though they may try to accuse you of doing wrong, still they'll see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. The word for glorify, it's a fancy word to say put the goodness of God on display. The idea, the day he visits us, that's like I think that's the last Tuesday of every month. I don't know. We don't know exactly when the day is that he visits us. But the idea, here's the general idea that he's trying to capture here. Ready? Let the goodness of your life point to the goodness of your God. This is the picture of real maturity. Like there is a way of life that's abundant, that's rich, that's full, and people see it and want to be part of it. They want to experience that for themselves. That's like the general idea that Peter's teaching here. But we also have a letter that Paul wrote to a church leader. This is someone who's going to teach people in the church, and he tells them how to teach them. He tells them what to say. He's teaching here to slaves. Now, when you and I hear slavery, we typically think of American history slavery, but this is slavery way before that. This is slavery in the Roman Empire. And in that world, you were often put into slavery because of a debt you had to pay. This is almost like, it's a parallel here to like working in the workplace. And so he says, teach slaves to be subject to their masters in everything, like to serve them willingly. He says to try to please them. Don't just do your job, like try to bring joy to them while you're doing it. Not to talk back to them and not to steal from them, but to show them that they can be fully trusted. Why? He says, so that in every way, they will make the teaching about God our Savior, the hero of our story. In every way, they'll make it attractive. If you're wondering, like what he's saying here is, if you're wondering, okay, like I'm in a workplace with a bunch of people that don't believe what I believe. They're inside my life, but they're outside my faith. Like, how do I live with them? Live in such a way that's attractive. Like, give yourself to your work. Do it well. Show that you can be trusted. Like, value excellence, even when it doesn't benefit you. Like, be the best worker in the group. And when people want to know why, like, you can point it back to your faith. Like, this is just part of what I believe. It's my job to do things like super well because I want the goodness of my life to point to the goodness of my God. The goodness of the way I work to point to the goodness of my God, right? In the workplace. And then he talks about the home. Like Peter talks about how to live in the home. There's people inside your life in the home, but outside your faith. Like, how do they perceive what's going on? How do you act toward them? He writes to people in the household, right? He addresses wives here. He says, wives, in the same way, submit yourselves to your own husbands. Now, I know this is not something that's like particularly exciting, especially among wives. However, this is partnered with the teaching that husbands also submit themselves to their wives. The idea is mutual submission. You serve one another. But in this verse, we just have the wives here, okay? So he says, in the same way, submit yourselves to your own husbands, so that if any of them don't believe, like if they're outsiders in terms of the faith, if they don't believe the word, the message of Jesus, they may be won over, not like roped in, not guilted into, not like have their arm twisted, but won over without words by the behavior of their wives. It's a picture of something that's attractive. And this applies to husbands. And it applies to parents. And it applies to kids. Like there's people in your life who are inside your life but outside your faith. How do you share what you have? Like, let the goodness of your life point to the goodness of your God. This is the picture of what complete devotion looks like. It's attractive. Now, if you're someone who has studied the Bible, if you're familiar with the teachings of Jesus, if you've been in church for a long time, maybe there's a pebble in your shoe. You know, like maybe you're sitting here thinking like, wait a minute. Jesus told his followers, and he told his followers that you'll be hated. And John, one of Jesus' closest followers, said, don't be surprised if the world hates you. And so what do we do with that, right? Remember how I said sometimes you gotta like zoom in and sometimes you gotta zoom out? Like that's a verse we often zoom into and we clip it out of its context and we're like, all right, if you're a follower of Jesus, everyone's gonna hate you. The end. But if you zoom in, or zoom out rather, to the context and look at what's going on in the world, Jesus was overthrowing a religious system that had been a certain way for a very long time. He was teaching people that they didn't have to do things that were part of the traditions of the rest of the religious community. And so those religious leaders hated him. Like there were all these crowds that loved him, and then there were religious leaders who felt like their power was being threatened, and those are the people that are responsible for ultimately his death. They're the ones that got him killed. And so Jesus is telling his followers like, hey, they're gonna do the same thing to you. If you continue this teaching, he's speaking to those people at that time, they're gonna do the same thing to you. At the same time, what we see is this early church that's existing in the world of the Roman Empire. Like the whole known world is under the power of Rome. And at that time, you were required to say that Caesar is Lord. And so you had these people of faith, these Christians that were like, I'm not doing that because Jesus is Lord. And that caused a lot of problems. There were Roman emperors who would blame like droughts on the church because they're not worshiping Roman gods. That must be why it's not raining in Rome. And so they would go after the Christians. Like what he's saying was very context specific. Like there was a very clear reason why they were disliked. But the trend over time was a community that was magnetic. In fact, the reason John says don't be surprised if people hate you is because if you're growing into someone who loves their enemies, who goes the extra mile, who does all the stuff Jesus says and becomes more loving, peaceful, patient, kind, it's gonna be surprising if people have a problem with you. But sometimes they will. And even if they do, even if someone comes up to you and says, I hate you simply because of what you believe and that's the end of it, still, if that's the case, which could happen, still, your job is to live in such a way that's attractive. Win them over. The reason I'm pointing that out is because there's a little bit of a trend, right? Maybe you've seen it in communities, maybe you've seen it on TV, but of religious leaders that are unapologetically abrasive and offensive. And when people have a problem with it, they're like, well, Jesus said the world's gonna hate us. And the gospel is offensive. When really in that moment, it's the messenger that's offensive, not the message. And so I'm saying that not to like shame certain people, but to point out that is not the example to follow. Paul gives and this is the last verse we're gonna look at. He gives more examples here. How do you live among people outside your faith? He says, okay, so if this is the case, right? If reproduction is the thing that happens when you're mature, and if that happens by being attractive, well, he says, be wise then, meaning give thought to your ways. Be wise in the way you act toward outsiders. Think about it. How am I being perceived? How's it gonna go over if I say this to this person that's going through this right now? Is now a good time to say this? Are they ready to hear that based on what's going on in their life and family? Make the most, he says, of every opportunity. And when you're speaking, he says, let your conversation be always full of grace, meaning make it so abundantly clear when you're talking to someone who's outside of your faith but inside of your life, make it so clear that you're for them. Like you're in their corner. This isn't win to prove someone wrong or to win an argument. Let your speech be seasoned with salt. In the ancient world, there wasn't this like abundance of natural flavors. Salt was what made things taste good. It's like your words, the way you communicate, it should be seasoned with salt. Let your words be thoughtfully chosen so that you may know how to answer everyone. The idea here, when it comes to spreading your faith, inviting people in, the idea here, being wise, it's do what works and don't do what doesn't work. There's freedom in that. If you're a strategic person, there's freedom to be strategic. There's freedom to be yourself in that. I had a neighbor a few years ago. When we first moved into our house, had a neighbor who lived right behind me. I was doing yard work in the backyard. I've told some of you this story before. I'm like sweating out in the sun. This guy I've never met, he comes, he pokes his head over the fence. He's like, hey, can I get you some water? And I'm like, thanks, sure. He's like throwing water bottles over the fence. Every time I saw him, he had something nice to say. The guy was just in my corner, full of grace. And I went inside one day, I told Allie, I was like, there's something different about the guy next door. And one day he walked into church and we looked at each other and he was surprised I was here and I was surprised he was here. It was like we had a secret. But he threw a bottle of water over the fence, not a Bible. He met me where I was. Like he was intentional, he was being wise. If your picture is a picture of someone you wouldn't want to be, if you think it would be ineffective to become the kind of person you think you have to be, you may not have to be that person. Right? Like for me, I'm not a huge fan of handing out pamphlets, like the little tracts that are like, believe this, and this is Jesus, and have this, and goodbye. Especially to strangers on the street. And the reason why is because like the success rate of selling anything to a stranger on the street with a pamphlet is not very high. Like in the context of New York where we live, like the most effective thing is like long-term relationships, like win people over. In a culture that's very skeptical, like be real. For us, we believe that like when someone goes looking for God on Long Island, on the South Shore of Long Island, you know where they go? They go to church on Sunday morning. And so we design a church service where people who are looking for God can find what they're looking for in a way that they understand. It's doing what works and not doing what doesn't work. And so really give thought to your ways. Like maybe your husband doesn't want to be here and you invite him every week. And maybe the best thing to do is stop inviting him. Right? Maybe in the way you parent. You think about what works and what doesn't. Allie and I decided real early on with our kids, like especially in the early years, God was going to come up like when we talked about good things, not the bad things. Like at first, when we drop a rule or a punishment, mom and dad are going to be the bad guys. But it's not going to be, you can't go to this place or do that thing because God said so. Right? It's easy to be like, you're wrong because of God, but we're going to Disneyland because of mom and dad. Like, well, what is that going to teach in the long run? So it's an invitation to be free. Like to do what works and don't do what doesn't work. Just invite your friend. Invite your friend to church. I read an article this past week that 80% of people said they would go to church if they were invited. That works, and give people space. Because it works. If it works. If someone wants to talk, be ready to talk, but you're free to do what works and freed up to not do what doesn't work. You know, I mentioned this last week, but a big part of the reason for this series is my own story. Like for years, I resisted church because I had a picture of what I was supposed to be if I embraced it completely, and I didn't want to be that. And then there came a point where I embraced it. And for a season, I became that because I thought it was what I was supposed to do. It was like very outwardly religious, obsessed with the rules, like coloring in between the lines, and talking about God at like every possible moment that I could, because I thought that's what I was supposed to do. Like I was the guy on the airplane you did not want to get stuck with. But it was with the best of intentions. I probably still am not the guy you want to get stuck with on the airplane, but for different reasons. I had an argument with my sister one time where, I'll never forget this. I'm sitting in her bedroom, and I was like, if you believe all this Jesus stuff, you shouldn't listen to music that's not about God. It's not worship music. Like, why would you listen to it if it's not bringing you closer to God? She's like, because it's better music, and I want to listen to it. Like, what I realized pretty quickly was that, like, with the best of intentions, I was pushing people further away from what I was trying to invite them into. And there came a point where I realized, like, okay, this was about 2 years into my, like, spiritual journey. I just stopped and asked myself, like, what would me 2 years ago need to hear from me now to get through to me? And that's where I began to understand, like, we have freedom to do what works and don't do what doesn't work. Bring it up when it feels right, when it's appropriate, when it's going to be most effective. In other words, like, you might be up there swinging out of your shoes when you can let the club do the work. Like, spend time with Jesus. Like, develop your own faith. Become someone who's more loving, more peaceful, more kind. Take an interest in people. And let your life do the work. Let the goodness of your life point to the goodness of your God.